This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. My name is Steve Guerra, and I will be your host. In this podcast, we will do exactly what the name of the podcast suggests. We will go beyond the big screen, by which I mean we will search for the real background, context, and true story behind movies. We will interview guest experts and authors to find out what the real story is behind our favorite books, films, television shows, genres, and much more. Beyond the Big Screen is meant to be a conversation between the guest, me, and of course you. We will dive deep into subjects to find out more. This podcast is a voyage of discovery into fascinating stories. We will dive into topics on science, history, sports, religion, literature, art, architecture, and much, much more just to get started. Just a little bit about me and my background if you're interested. I have hosted various podcasts, including the History of the Papacy podcast since 2013. I'm a teacher by trade. Most people think that when I say that I'm a teacher, that I must be a professor or high school teacher at least. In actuality, though, I have taught foundational reading and writing to elementary school children, especially struggling readers, for over 15 years. I don't know if that experience has helped me as a podcaster. I'd like to think it has, though. It has maybe informed the way I approach topics. Beyond the Big Screen, though, is not about me. It's about all of us, the topics, the guests, and most importantly, you. Okay, so now we've talked about what this podcast is, but let's also talk about what it is not. Beyond the Big Screen is not a movie review podcast. We may talk about the relative quality of movies, but we will not grade them. Also, be prepared for spoilers. We are exploring topics here. We've got to get into the details for our exploration. The discussion will not be an event-by-event description of any particular movie, though, so don't worry. The purpose of this podcast is to develop a deeper understanding of the topics that are discussed in movies and other media. I really appreciate that you've decided to come along with me on this journey. Add your voice to the conversation. You can like us on Facebook and Twitter by following the links in the show notes. You can also email me with questions, comments, or show and guest ideas. Send those to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I always appreciate your support as well. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think about the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. Leave ratings and review on your podcatcher app of choice. If you like Beyond the Big Screen, tell a friend. Tell more than one friend. Keep your podcatchers updated for new episodes and updates all the time. If you are listening to this podcast on or around June 28th of 2021, when the podcast is launched, and you go ahead over to iTunes, search for the podcast, and leave a rating and review on iTunes, you can go over to BeyondTheBigScreen.com to learn how you can enter into a drawing to win a $50 Amazon gift card. That will be ending soon, so definitely go and do that right away. But we will also be having periodic drawings and contests for other merch, so I think you'll definitely stay tuned for more like that. Now listen to the next few minutes and you will get just a small sampler of teasers from a few of the great conversations you will get to join in on Beyond the Big Screen. You'll hear from the great Eric Fogg of the Reconsider podcast. You'll be hearing a lot from Eric. He has really thought-provoking insights and incredible passion. You'll also hear from some incredible authors like noted New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman. We talk frequently with someone who you are likely familiar with, our own Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast. Finally, the last little teaser we have is you will hear a little bit of a very personal story of a veteran storyteller and podcaster, Ray Christian. I hope you enjoy these teasers, and I will see you next time beyond the big screen.
Every time I've seen it just with another person, like me and one other person in the dark, we are dead silent through that entire scene. But every time I see it with audiences, people laugh. And every time Hal says something, people laugh. And it actually reminded me of another Nietzsche book, Birth of Tragedy, where it's the tension is so high that like in this collective group, we're actually not able to sustain it. Because Hal is so desperate, and we're so like we start to connect with Hal. Now he's a murderous, rampaging AI, but all of a sudden we feel his fear and his agony and his anguish, and so these audiences, we actually like laugh because we can't sustain that tension in a bunch of other people. It's just too much. It's too intimate. It is too intimate for us to be able to fully experience it in a big group of people. And so people, when Hal is saying, "I've made a terrible mistake, Dave, and I'm very sorry," people laugh, and it's absurd. But I think that was intentional, because it's just too much for us. And that's how human Hal is in some ways. Not in the same way as the replicants, who are very familiar human. Hal is still in the uncanny valley. He's still weird, and we don't like him, right? But we do feel empathy for his fear of death. And oh God, it's just so good. It's so well done.
What was moving Christianity forward through the 100s and the 200s and the 300s in this movement towards becoming a dominant religion in the Roman Empire? Was it fait accompli at that time, or were there some things happening along the way?
It wasn't at all a fait accompli. And you might think if you go from 20 people to 3 million people in 300 years, you've got to have some mass conversions going on. There need to be like these Billy Graham rallies where thousands of people come forward. I mean, how else is it going to happen? What I argue in my book is that it doesn't have to be that way. There was a sociologist of religion some years ago who wrote a book about this topic. Rodney Stark wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity. Stark is not a historian of ancient Christianity or of the ancient world, and his book actually didn't get received very well by biblical scholars or by scholars of early Christianity because there are a lot of problems with it. But the one thing about him is that he's a sociologist, and nobody can crunch numbers better than a sociologist. And so what he knows how to figure population growth. And so what he did is he did something that nobody had ever tried before, which is he crunched the numbers. And he asked, how do you get from a small number early on to 5 or 6 million 300 years later? And what he shows is that you don't need to have massive conversions, and you don't need to have a miracle. All you really need is steady growth. And in his book, he argues that what you need is for the Christian church to grow at a rate of 40% every decade. In other words, if this year you've got 100 Christians, in 10 years from now you need 140 Christians, which means basically you need to convert 3 or 4 people a year. The 100 of you need to convert 3 or 4 a year. So what I do in my book is I show why his Stark's numbers are problematic in a lot of ways, but I show why the basic idea is right, and I tweak the numbers and I come up with, they're fairly comparable numbers actually, because it's absolutely right that what happens is you can, if there are 100 of you and you convert, say 3 or 4 people this year, If it's 1,000 of you, then that 3 or 4 people is 30 or 40 people this year. If it's 10,000, then it's 300 or 400 of you a year, and you just keep going up like that. When you got 1 million people, and if you're converting, say 3%, well, okay, yeah. So 3% of 1 million is 30,000 people in 1 year. So then, at the same rate of growth, you're converting 30 or 40,000 people every year, and you do. So it's an exponential curve. And so what I show in this book is that early on, Christians are a very, very, very tiny little minority that nobody's ever heard of, and that's true even by the year 100. We sometimes think that Christianity 100 is starting to make a big impact on the Roman Empire. If you actually crunch the numbers, they're probably less than 1/60th of 1% of the empire at that point. And so most people have never even heard of them. But you keep going at that rate of growth, and when you get to about the year 300, you're up to 3 million people. And so it's a highly significant number.
How do viruses mutate, and how quickly do they mutate when they're passing between people?
Yeah, viruses are under selection pressure, just like living things are. So there's some disagreement in the biological world as to whether viruses are alive or not. So kind of dance around that subject. But just like living things, they have they have genes that they're trying to pass on to the next generation. Sometimes these viruses have genes that make them incredibly fast and deadly, and so they have to spread in a really short amount of time. And if the disease has milder symptoms, then they're going to be spreading. They have a longer amount of time to spread. So from the virus's perspective, lethality to your host is actually not a good thing. So some viruses mutate more quickly than others. So, for example, every single year we see a new strain of the flu, right? So that's why we have to get a new flu shot every year. But dengue, the dengue virus actually only has 4 strains that we currently know about.
Does John Wayne, and Mongolian is a Turkic language, if I'm not mistaken. So with your expertise, John Wayne obviously nailed a Turkish accent, right?
Yeah, it was really good. I mean, well, it's when you watch it, he is not doing anything different in his voice from whatever you would see in any John Wayne movie. He does not do anything but be himself, and which there are a couple times in this movie where it works because his actual character is completely unlikable. He kidnaps his wife, and she develops Stockholm Syndrome for him. And if you don't bank on the fact that it's John Wayne and you're watching the movie and think, okay, he's the protagonist, so I guess I'm supposed to root for him. So by not even getting to the character, it does work because his actual written character is completely unlikable and impulsive. He says stupid things. I feel this totter woman is for me. My blood says take her, pilgrim. So he's totally impulsive, completely unlikable. It doesn't work as history, and it also doesn't work as film.
As a 17-year-old, what were your motivations for joining the military? And did you get a sense of any of those things going on, or was the military what was that feeling at that time?
In the neighborhood, I can recall plenty of guys who were getting drafted, plenty of them who ended up in the Marine Corps. I can see in my mind's eyes these teenage guys that I knew were playing high school football, and within a year or two, they were drafted into the military. Some of these guys weren't the best scholars, or some of them were dropouts. But they still ended up getting drafted. Anyway, in later years, there was still this thing in the community, in poor communities, that being in the military is better than doing nothing. And I think that when you come from a background that's harsh or hard or extreme, risking your life in a job is not that all unusual. The military is a shot. They pay you money. Yeah, you could get killed, but you could get killed fixing a car, just walking down the damn street. So it's a different kind of mindset and environment like that. You don't get as many people who join purely for patriotism. Now, my exact motivation was I thought I would check their block, get some respect. Maybe I'd get a little training. I had no intention of being a career soldier. And when I joined, there were a lot of people that had that same general reasoning. There were guys who graduated from high school or didn't graduate from high school, young, kind of athletic, didn't really have anything going, factory job maybe. The military was interesting. And for me, I was also looking for the excitement angle. That may not have been everybody's cup of tea, but I had that, had no other options. It was appealing to me.
That sounds too like you were probably coming at a time where the factory jobs, it was probably on the horizon that some of those jobs weren't going to be there very long.
Oh, it was becoming very, very clear as you saw people losing those jobs. I can remember when I was in high school, people actually dropped out of high school to get jobs at the tobacco factory. Now, thinking back in that time, minimum wage was about $3 an hour. Guys could drop out of high school and get a job at the tobacco factory for $6.50 an hour. And I can remember guys dropping out 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. But within about 2 years, all those guys were laid off from those factory jobs. It didn't last. Didn't last.